All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this Budget and Finance Committee meeting for Monday, December 5th. I got to call this meeting to order, please. Thank you. Welcome to this meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, December 5th, 2016. I'm Paul Krikorian, joined by my colleagues, Council Members Englander and Blumenfield, and we're ready to begin. Members, of course, we have our FSR today, so start thinking about your departmental questions. But in the interim, I would have proposed items 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 for consent approval, but we do have cards on those matters. So I'm going to ask Wayne Spindler to come forward and speak for 4 minutes on the agenda items and 1 minute on general public comment. So let's go ahead and set his time for, you know what, let's set it for 4 minutes and then we'll do the general public comment with 1 minute separately.
Okay, thank you. All right, so today there's no lawsuits, so I'm sorry. I mean, normally this is where I thank everybody for suing the city, but there's no lawsuits today to settle. So anyway, we have a bunch of reports. So let's see what we got here. The second financial status report, number 1. I think we should just receive and file this because it has bad news in it, and it's Monday. We don't want to start off Monday with bad news. So let's receive and file number 1. Number 2, we have the Sidewalk Repair Responsibility Ordinance. Yes, anyway, this is the single most destructive thing that has come around in a long time. Basically, because of Willits versus City of Los Angeles, the city needs to come up with $30 million a year. They don't have it, so they're going to take and steal it from private property owners and make them fix sidewalks that aren't theirs or never were theirs, and kill a bunch of trees to save costs on trimming trees. This is the biggest fraud and scam ever in this city, and that's saying a lot. And I know a lot of you here today, you don't really have members of the public that know about these meetings. They don't usually testify. So unfortunately, the only people that are going to be here are people that are going to profit from this misery. But we have at least one councilman that we can reach out to here to say that I think this is a terrible idea. I think that people are going to get taxed and hurt by this. I don't think it's going to be a good thing, though. San Fernando Valley is going to get murdered by this. There's a lot more sidewalks in the San Fernando Valley to fix because you just have wider spaces. It's going to put an unfair burden on the San Fernando Valley. And I urge that the increases and the modifications and the fees be increased for the valley, because the valley has a lot more width and a lot larger lots, especially in CD12 and in the west part of CD3 and in Encino and CD5 and 6. So they're going to give a limit of 1 tree, 2 trees. I think that all of those things should be doubled or tripled for those homeowners because they're going to be unfairly burdened and unfairly taxed by this, and you're not even going to vote on it. So it's a terrible idea. Number 2, it should be voted down no, but the problem is the city's broke, because if you look at report number 1, you'll see that you're going to steal it, and the commercial property owners, you're going to get reamed by this program. Your warranty is only for 5 years on your sidewalks, not 20. They're going to start citing your properties. If you're a commercial property owner, you're going to have to fix it, or the city will come out and fix it. They will put a lien on your property plus penalties, and you will wind up having a massive lien. You could lose your property over this. This is not right. And this is not what Willits intended. Willits intended for you to fix the sidewalks and not put it as a tax without a vote under Proposition 13 and Proposition 26. Hopefully there's a lawyer out here that will sue to get an injunction to stop item number 2, because it should be voted on by the voters, because it is really a tax on property. It is not a cumulative or reparative measure. So number 3, I'll let the puppet finish on the other items, so go ahead. No. Okay, the puppet doesn't want to talk. So anyway, so we have seniors, yes on 3, investment reports on item 4, Okay, 5. Oh, number 6, we support that, me and the puppet. Yes. Okay, so we got 1 minute? Okay, great. So,
Wait.
oh,
Before you begin.
yeah.
It starts kind of over, but before you begin.
Yeah, we'll do.
Do we have any other cards on items 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8?
No, sir, no other cards.
Comment on those items is closed. Do we have any cards on 1, 2, and 9 other than Mr. Spencer's?
No, sir, no other cards.
Comment on those items is closed. Proceed with your general public comment.
Okay. One good thing we have coming forward, and one thing that was settled, was the Brendan Glenn assassination and murder. So it's reported the settlement's going to be for $4 million plus. I appreciate the amount, but what I would like in this case is a concession by the city of liability. You settle these cases without admitting liability. The attorney for the family stated that the amount is in itself an admission of guilt. The city murdered Brendan Glenn. And I think it's time that the city admit it as part of the settlement, that they take responsibility and that the officers involved be prosecuted. Jackie Lacey's got to do her job. No cop has been prosecuted for any of these killings yet in the past 10 years. This was outrageous. It was an affront to the people in the community of Venice. But nevertheless, for your part, I thank you for taking your responsibility here. That's it.
All right. Thank you very much. Are there any other general public comment cards?
No, sir, no other cards.
Thank you. General public comment is closed, and that brings us then, members, to item number 1, the second FSR. So I'm going to ask the CAO to come on up and report. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Maria Gutierrez with the City Administrative Officer.
That's how with the CAO.
Today we present the second FSR. It is an abbreviated FSR that updates projected year-end deficits and recommends necessary transactions that are needed to ensure departments have sufficient funds to cover financial obligations pending the release of our mid-year FSR. When we reported on the first FSR in October, we noted that the projected $15.73 million year-end expenditure deficit would increase as a result of unanticipated expenditures in the liability claims account, the Human Resources Benefits Fund, and from soon-to-be-adopted labor agreements. Based on recent developments and more current expenditure data now available, the projected year-end expenditure deficit has increased to $81.68 million. We are now reporting shortfalls in the liability claims account of approximately $39 million. And of this $39 million, $16 million is attributed to the Independent Living Center settlement agreement. We're also reporting an $11 million deficit in the Human Resources Benefits Fund. Other reported shortfalls include $1 million in the Attorney Conflicts Panel Fund and an increase to the Fire Department shortfall from $1.6 million to $19.1 million. This results from the recently approved labor agreement with UFLAC and an increase in estimated costs for fire, boat overhaul, and repairs. Relative to the reserve fund balance has increased slightly from 5.18% to 5.29% of the adopted general fund budget. Combined with the budget stabilization fund, we are at 6.98%. This represents about $16 million above the 5% threshold, which is not enough to address the existing deficits, let alone a larger deficit that may result from pending litigation. As a result, we are recommending that departments make the necessary adjustments to mitigate their own shortfalls within existing department resources, and that any new spending proposals for the current fiscal year be withdrawn and resubmitted as part of the budget development process for fiscal year 2017-18. In addition, this office is exploring the potential issuance of up to $70 million in judgment obligation bonds to finance eligible liability payouts. Proceeds from the judgment obligation bonds would help reimburse the reserve fund to restore it back above the 5% policy level by year end. Any issuance of bonds, of course, would require mayor and council approval, and in the case of the JOB, a court validation process. Relative to revenue, the potential general fund revenue shortfalls are not included in the $81.68 million year-end deficit projection, but they are highlighted in this report given their major downside risks. Current general fund revenue is tracking $35.6 million below plan receipts, which is an improvement from the $52.9 million reported in the first FSR. However, there are multiple downside risks to city revenues, which are highlighted in our report. These downside risks include the power revenue transfer due to lower than projected power sales in the prior and current year, the utility users tax due to lower electric users tax revenue, the sales tax due to declining gasoline prices, parking fine revenue due to unfilled part-time and full-time traffic officer positions and the resulting decline in ticket issuance. Franchise fee revenue, which is attributed to a decrease in cable television and taxi cab franchise revenue. Also, there are downside risks to departmental receipts. Based on revised revenue estimates provided by departments as part of their fiscal year 2017-18 budget submissions, plus an anticipated reduction in related cost reimbursements due to overpayments in fiscal year 15-16, a total revenue shortfall of approximately $70.6 million is projected. However, this office is currently reviewing the $70.6 million, and it is just a preliminary estimate at this time. There is a positive trend. There's a positive trend in TOT revenue, which is now $3.1 million above plan receipts through October as a result of $6.1 million in additional revenue from the negotiated collection agreement with Airbnb. Due to all of these concerns, this office recommends that any new policies under consideration that could further reduce current year general fund receipts be held from consideration until this office can provide greater clarity on revenues in the mid-year FSR. Our report provides budget balancing solutions to offset this $81.68 million. The recommendation in this report reduces that $81.68 million to $65.68 due to the appropriation of $16 million from the UB budgetary shortfalls account to the Independent Living Center settlement agreement for attorney's fees. If the police department continues its efforts to absorb a portion of its deficit internally, approximately $5.54 million could be offset. The remaining $1 million in the UB budgetary shortfall account could also be used to offset citywide deficit, which would further reduce the deficit to $59.23. We've identified potential departmental and non-departmental savings of approximately $4.95 million. There is also the potential for use of forfeited assets trust funds to offset the remaining portion of the fire department, the police department deficit, which is tied to unfunded costs that due to the reversion of prior year funds. If these items hold true, we would further reduce the deficit to approximately $52.44 million. Our office will continue to monitor the status of these year-end deficits and report in the next FSR. Total appropriations of $64.5 million and budgetary adjustments are ultimately recommended. But in addition to the $16 million mentioned previously, we are also recommending a transfer of $12 million in connection to the Willits case from the UB Sidewalk litigation account. We have submitted some amendments that are necessary to this second FSR. These are strictly, they're considered technical adjustments. They have been submitted to your clerk. We are amending recommendation 3. We're revising the net transfer amount between accounts within departments and funds, as specified in revised attachment 5. And this is due to updated balances within the liability claims account. We are also recommending an amendment to recommendation number 4 to reflect a revised attachment 6. And this is to correct a transfer for the police department. The transfer should be from the sworn salary account, overtime account, as opposed to the civilian overtime account. So that account should now read the sworn overtime account. And this involves a $1.345 million transfer. We have a technical correction to attachment 7, so we're recommending an amendment to recommendation number 5 to reflect the revised attachment 7, and it's just to correct the department number for the Board of Public Works. Earlier today, we were also made aware of an additional transfer needed by the fire department. We have also submitted that to your clerk.
How much was that?
And this is a transfer of $400,000. The fire department is requesting a transfer of $400,000 from their salary sworn account to their brush clearance account. And this is required for contract brush clearance in high fire hazard severity zones. We are available to answer any additional questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. Members, questions for the CAO? Mr. Blumenfield.
The litigation bonds, how much did you say that was going to be, that we're using that to?
We don't know the exact amount yet. And once again, this is Ben Sahel with the CAO. We are hoping to explore anything between $50 and $70 million worth of judgment obligation bonds. That would help us cover the costs of some of the litigation that we've been settling this year. There's been identified cases that have been approved and recommended already for potentially be included as part of the judgment obligation bond, and others that we expect will be coming to this body shortly.
And do we have a policy or a process of when and how we use those litigation bonds? I mean, it seems like you want to do it in times when we're getting hit by a lot and we want to spread it out over time, and then our revenues are not increasing, but that can't be the only reason.
Natalie Brill, CAO's office. We do judgment obligation bonds when we feel there is a need to keep our reserves at a certain level, for example, or we feel that the market is such that we can do them and there's enough cases. You know, in this case, there's been a significant increase in the amount of liability claims that have been paying out or recommended to be paid out.
Right.
So we saw an opportunity to go to the market and do that. And that's why I think Ben was saying that we want to do it somewhere around $50 million so that we can take advantage of the economies of scale. The last time we did one was in 2010, so this is not normal course of business. This is when we think it's advantageous for us to do so, that it makes more sense to do than to pay out in cash, for example. And I think that's the trade-off. You're looking at paying something in cash versus doing debt for it and being able to keep your reserve fund at the 5% level.
Because unlike other issuances, judgment obligation bonds are paid over 10 years, and there's no opportunity to refund those. They have to be paid over 10 years. And so it is a calculation that needs to take place with regard to what we think would happen if our reserves dip too far below 5%, versus how that would be perceived, versus issuing and debt financing some of these liabilities over a 10-year period.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. It's just, it seems like it would be good if we had a coherent policy. It seems like we're applying it because it makes sense in this case, and we have enough built up, and
Correct.
And our reserves are a little dangerously low, and all those factors conspire to make it make sense. But it might have made sense 2 years ago as well. You know, interest rates were down, and it never came up as an idea. Or at least I don't remember coming up. And that may be fine. I'm just trying to understand if we
I
need
think
to
it's a
do work on it.
trade-off. Like I said, I think it's a trade-off between how much cash you have,
Yeah.
how large your reserves are, versus going to the market for a short period of time, which is 10 years, right? And yes, interest rates have gone up, but interest rates are not at the same level as they were, in 2008 or 2009.
Right.
Obviously, 9 and 10 were very difficult years for the city. And that's when the decision was made to do a 10-year bond and do judgment obligation bonds. And also, we had, quite a few large cases. In this case, I think when we see more and more cases moving forward, and we see more and more money leaving this, being paid for these cases, I think that's when we kind of stood up and said, well, does it make sense to look at them in the aggregate and not singularly as we have in the past? Last year, for example, I think the controller reported that we spent, $110 million on liability cases. So when you start looking at those numbers, you kind of think, well, is there anything we can do this year to help keep some of the cash here with the city and go out during a period of time where we think the bonds will do well?
Sure. And smooth out the impact of, what would otherwise be a choppy.
But it definitely does speak to, the last year was like Natalie said, almost $110 million in liability expenditures, which was greater than the average. On average, we've been spending between $60 and $70 million, so this was higher. This year, we're definitely trending above that 110 as well. So it does speak to perhaps as we look at the 17-18 budget and begin developing that budget for next fiscal year, making sure we start budgeting based on these new trends and working with the city attorney to identify those cases that are out there and potentially will become either settled or ruled on in the next fiscal year.
And another area, the DWP power transfer, we're saying there's or that issue is causing us a slight tweak, right?
So on that, we mentioned that it's what we're reporting on is based on the sales of power for the last fiscal year.
Is there any reflection of any other transfer issues, litigation, or anything else that?
So the numbers that Melissa Krantz, Office of the CAO, the numbers that Maria Gutierrez reported do not include any litigation. The impact that's showing right now is solely from declining power sales. So last year's receipts came in lower than expected, so that would result in a lower transfer for this year. And then currently what we're seeing with lower power sales this year is reflected in our electric utility users tax. What is not showing is any litigation concerning the transfer or overbilling.
Right. And is that because there's no direct impact this year, or is that because any of those costs may not have shown up on the official radar yet?
It's my understanding is it's still a negotiation, so we don't want to put any numbers out there.
Mr. Englander?
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you brought it up, Bob, because I had some serious concerns and questions regarding our judgment obligation bonds as well. I remember when it was done in 2010, and if I can quote, if I remember, our CAO saying this is probably the worst kind of debt we can possibly take on. Mm-hmm. Without taking too much of a deep dive into this, because I actually had some notes I wanted to go through and some questions I want to ask. As it relates to, I think, item 8, it's virtually the same, teeing it up for city attorney to come back. So I think that's probably more appropriate than this conversation. So I'll wait till we get to item 8, and I think you've already actually teed it up, which I'm grateful for, so thanks for bringing that up. So I'll definitely bring it up when we get to that. On that note, I think that's all I've really got. Just on a footnote, I wanted to make sure that this is the first year ever that we have police overtime is actually part of their MOU, and that we don't go over that, and we have some regular updates as to how we're doing that are outside of the FSR, which I understood we were going to get some regular updates, not just on the FSR. So I want to make sure that we're hitting that mark, and there's a separate process for that as well.
Yeah, the last, we did report on police overtime as part of the last financial status report,
right.
The first financial status report. As Maria mentioned, this one was somewhat of a truncated process in order for us to get a report with immediate and necessary transactions before the end of the calendar year. But it is a plan for either as part of the FSR or through a separate report to be reporting on police overtime matters. I think it's going to be best to report on it probably before the mid-year as well, because the mid-year probably won't be here until later, more in the springtime. So if there's an opportunity and I think a need to come, we will be reporting on the police overtime matter via separate report.
Great, okay. Thank you. One more.
Yeah, I'll probably ask more about this of the city attorney's office, I think, but just since we're on this topic of the JO bond, your recollection matches mine, Mr. Englander, when we talked about this before, and I think this is typically bad practice, but not always, and it depends upon the circumstances of a given year, which is why it's not helpful to have a press release or an audit report or a newspaper article that gives some big scary number, because it's out of context. And whether the city has $60 million in liability in a year or $100 million or $2 million means nothing to anyone unless it's compared to trend lines. And just putting out a number it's not even half of the equation. So this is why I've asked for the comprehensive report from the city attorney's office analyzing litigation trends over the course of many years, analyzing claim trends department by department, so that we can actually break down in our risk management process where are the vulnerabilities, where are areas where we can prevent future liability before it arises, and where are the unusual spikes. Because where we have unusual spikes, where it's aberrational, for example, the false imprisonment cases that we had, I think that was this last year. I mean, these are extraordinarily expensive settlements, and they should be, because it's for terrible wrongdoing that happened a decade or a generation ago that we have no choice but to pay for now. Now, that's very aberrational. That's not an indication of anything that the city is doing operationally or otherwise that can be dealt with through risk management. So in those sorts of circumstances, a JO bond makes a great deal of sense. But it does not make sense if the number is just going up and we don't expect it to, go back. That's like paying your rent on your credit card. It makes no sense. So that's what we're going to have to dig a lot deeper into, over the course of the coming months. And, maybe this becomes a budgetary issue too. The only reason we're having to pay for this in an unusual way is because it's over what we've budgeted.
That's right.
And if the trend lines indicate that we should be budgeting more for liability, then we're just going to have to bite the bullet and do that. So before we get into budget season, I expect that report will come back from the city attorney with a very robust data pool that we're going to assess in very, very close detail to be able to make some of those more difficult decisions. Sorry, Mr. Blumenfield, sorry.
That was a different line of questioning, but just along that, and the other factor is what the interest rates are, and the financials all play into that decision. My question would be more broad about how much of the deficit that we're seeing this year is truly structural, and how much is one time of this new deficit, or have you broken it down that way?
Well, it hasn't necessarily been broken down to that effect. What we can tell you is as reported, there's a new deal for firefighters in the fire department. So that's going to be a structural expenditure increase that we'll be having to deal with new budgets. As the chair indicated, if this is a new trend with regard to liability, then that, I would say, is also structure that needs to be dealt with as part of the budget process as well. So, those two items as part of the expenditures noted here are two of the larger items. So I would say the majority of this is structural.
Thank you.
Mr. Englander, anything further? No. Okay, thank you very much. Can I hold this matter on the table just for a second? Can I procedurally do that? Let me hold this matter on the table. Without objection, members, I had proposed items 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 for consent approval of the recommendations on number 3, 7, and 8, and noting and filing items 4, 5, and 6. Any objections or concerns about any of those?
Consent on those, you
matters?
said?
Yeah.
I did have a question on 8.
You want to hold 8? Okay, so we'll hold 8, and then items, without objection, items 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, the action of the committee will be as I've indicated. If there's no objection, there's none, and that will be the action of the committee. So that, then we can come back now to the FSR, and let's go ahead and get our departmental roll call so we can get everybody who doesn't need to stay back to work. Mr. Blumenfield, any good? No departments?
Do you have anything on 9?
Yeah.
Good for you.
What'd you do on 9?
9 we're holding.
Oh, I'm good with 9, okay.
Yeah. Mr. Englander, any departmental questions?
No. Good.
Really? Well, now you're making me a little bit sheepish because we have an opportunity to set a record here on the, I don't think this has ever happened on an FSR.
Well, it's the ability to, the thing is, Mr. Chair, is that the departments make themselves so available to our offices before we have the opportunity to even meet and go through
This is
and
true.
vet these, that while there is concern, I've certainly had the opportunity to meet with them directly. So.
Well, I'll tell you what.
Go ahead.
I just can't resist the temptation of creating the first ever FSR with no departmental questions. So I do have one more question for the CAO, I think, and that was, but before I get to that, it appears we have no departmental questions. So thank you to the department representatives who are here. No need to stick around. See you later. And as they're exiting, thank you for coming. I noticed that one of your considerations on revenues was the decline in taxicab franchise fees. And I'm wondering what you attribute that loss of franchise fees to other than the reduced amount. Is that the entirety of it?
Right now, that we believe that's the entirety of it. We had been taking into account the declining trend in taxi cab revenue, with the competition from the Uber and Lyft. This is a reduction on top of it, but it wouldn't be until probably we have a good 6 months worth of receipts to see how much of it. That $1 million figure was the department estimate, Department of Transportation estimate, when they considered reducing the taxi cab franchise fee factor.
Okay. So how much of that loss of revenues will be made up by the increase in revenues that we're seeing in the ride-sharing franchise fees?
I would have to do that analysis. The departments just submitted their revenue budgets along with, of course, their proposed budget, so we'd have to look through and see what they're coming up with.
Okay. Thank you. Anything further, members?
One more.
Yeah, Mr. Bloomfield.
Because when we were talking about the franchise fee, the other thing we talked about was the parking receipts.
Oh, yes.
And so it reminded me of that, which is, it's the classic example. You never want to not have enough meter readers, because they actually raise revenue. How is it that we're in that boat, and how fast are we going to get out of that?
So Department of Transportation, if I recall, during their last report, during the first FSR, they had talked about how they're trying to move some of the part-time traffic officers to full-time traffic officer positions, but they also talked about the conflicts that they have with regards to meeting special event needs. If they have someone who's committed to show up and do special events, but they don't show, they do have to pull regular traffic officers off ticket issuing. So they have some issues with that. So what they're trying to do is get more staffing. They believe that the staffing would solve some of their declining issuances and therefore receipts, but what our office expects to see is a bigger deficit in the short term as it grows, and then some declining towards the end of the year. They have given us a preliminary shortfall of about $5 million at the end of the year for that category.
This came up last time in the last FSR too, where
Yes.
we didn't, it was the same dynamic, and it seems like there's no downside to getting the staffing done as quickly as possible.
My understanding is they've been working with personnel to get those positions up. I don't know if our DOT analyst is here. I could make some stuff up for you, but
Yeah.
they would be a better expert.
And that was the one that I was going to hold, but you guys hectored me out of it. So, but you're right. This is a discussion that we've been having for a very long time. Yeah, it's in multiple years now. It's not months about filling these positions, and enough already. We got to figure out a solution to get this done. So, but I didn't want to break our record and
Right. Well,
make that point to DOT directly, but we will revisit that, I'm sure, by the time of the next.
If I could just make a quick comment on that, not for revenue, and not from a revenue perspective, but simply because if they're ticketing, then it's not for us for looking at the revenue, but that means those are probably cars parked illegally blocking traffic, and so we're having more of a traffic problem. So it's really to ease the traffic, not looking at it from a revenue perspective. Just wanted to hang a lantern on that.
And not just traffic, but it's
all the
a
other-
very real safety issue. Because most of the tickets that are written, there's the meter tickets, but an awful lot of them are directly related to safety and traffic. And the revenue part of it is just that if you can achieve that important policy objective and have fines pay for it, then you should be doing that. You have no excuse not to do it. So anyway,
And the traffic.
but that's a discussion we really shouldn't have after I let poor DOT go. So we'll have that discussion when they're here to engage in it. So. All right. Anything further, members, on the FSR? Okay.
Mr. Chair, I do want to state
yes.
that, one thing that we failed to highlight in our summary right now is that when combined with the Budget Stabilization Fund, our reserves are closer to 7%.
I'm sorry?
When combined with our Budget Stabilization Fund, our reserves are closer to 7%, which should be noted because it's, we've been doing, your leadership, making sure we always address it in the budget.
Thank you. Can't be noted often enough. Thank you, Mr. Seha. All right, so if there's nothing further, it'll be the action of the committee to, without objection, to approve the CAO's recommendations with the amendments that have been submitted. No objection, that'll be the action of the committee. And that brings us to item number 2.
Item number 2 is a Bureau of Engineering report relative to modifying the proposed sidewalk repair responsibility draft ordinance to restore the requirement for developers to fix sidewalks fronting development projects, transfer sidewalk responsibility to the property owner if a private tree prevents sidewalk repair, and establish fee waivers for easements providing for meandering sidewalks and to save street trees.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Gary Lee Moore, City Engineer.
Ted Allen, Deputy City Engineer.
Would you like us to give us a brief overview, or?
I'm not sure that it's necessary. I think these are largely technical changes, but I think Mr. Blumenfield had a recommendation. But Mr. Englander, why don't we go to your question first?
You got a recommendation, maybe that'll answer my question.
Okay, I'll take the floor then.
Oh, no,
Okay.
This is a very minor point. Raised it at the last hearing, and I wanted it to be included in the technical changes. I didn't see it, so that's why I've added an amending motion. And it deals with currently the section 62104B states the owner of a lot shall maintain any sidewalk, driveway, approach, curb, return, or curb on the lot. Subsection C includes the language the board shall notify the owner of the lot containing the sidewalk, driveway. However, in Los Angeles, a lot of sidewalks, curbs, and driveways are in the public right-of-way adjacent to or abutting a lot, but are not, quote, on the lot itself, and the lot does not contain them. It's technical, but it could actually cost us if we don't address it. So to address it, the prior version of code imposed the repair obligation on owners or occupants of lots or portions of lots fronting on said sidewalk. And so we're basically adding that language in.
Correct.
That's the recommendation to deal with that issue.
So since that's a technical thing, I turn to the expert on all things technical. Mr. Moore, does that make sense?
Absolutely, and we understand the spirit of what Mr. Blumenfield's asking for, and we'll work closely with the city attorney to make sure that's incorporated into the proposed ordinance changes.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Englander.
Okay, and then in terms of you have essentially you've identified 3 technical amendments. My question was on the third one, on the fee waivers for easements to meandering sidewalks and street trees. BOE requests the authorization to issue the fee waivers for permit or other fees necessary to transfer dedications or easements to the city for the purpose of meandering or sidewalk to save a street tree, then design would require to comply with the Bureau of Street Services Urban Forestry. So with this, though, also the dedication of private property, it goes to the city in that case. So what mechanism would be put in place to ensure the upkeep of the area of the easement? Is this not inviting any future litigation to save a tree? Because this is where we would carve out that differential that we're doing for the rest of the program. And
Right.
that's
I'm sorry.
a little bit of a concern. So walk me through that.
So basically, right now, on your property, we have an easement for the sidewalk area. And so what we're doing is modifying or expanding this easement for sidewalks. So the same requirements that are currently on property owners would apply to this wider sidewalk area to go around and save the tree.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It would make sense if it read it that way, but that's not how I read it.
Okay.
So what you're suggesting, though, is perhaps not the way it's, maybe it is the way it's written, different meaning, but, so they would assume under the meandering scenario, the full easement to a greater depth or width, depending on how far it's going to extend out, because it's meandering, and so they all have the same assumption and maintenance responsibility. It doesn't go back to then, because it's meandering, this permanent easement doesn't go back to the city. They still get...
Yeah,
it's
the
still
normal public right-of-way is dedication to the city, so we're just they're voluntarily expanding it a little bit so the sidewalk can meander a little closer to their home or business. So as Gary mentioned, it would just be an expansion, probably very small, 4 or 5 feet, a lot of times maybe even less in some.
And where it meanders away and it's further, they would still have the responsibility for maintaining that as well, is what you're suggesting?
Correct.
That's correct.
Got it. Okay. All right. Okay.
How would it meander further? You mean into the street?
Well, it depends on what they design. I mean, especially on a new development. There's different cases. I don't believe we have a lot of meandering sidewalks in the city of LA that I can think
Not a
of.
lot of, but I see what
But I've seen-
aspect you were thinking of. So the way
When it goes
this would-
closer and then when it goes right.
Yeah, the ones closer, we wouldn't need
That's
any
not an
additional
issue.
dedication.
Right, but
So
the ones
this was
further
just
away.
trying to account for the situations where we need additional easement to go further away
Right.
from the street.
Okay. And that would pick that up and they would bear the brunt of the responsibility on
Yeah,
that.
they would voluntarily grant the easement, but then the city in return would record it at no cost is what.
And they would still be responsible for the maintenance of it.
Correct.
That is correct.
Just as a release would
Mm-hmm.
from the
Right.
fix and release. Okay. Okay.
And just one other note I would like to share with you is, as of this afternoon, we've had approximately 170 people apply to the rebate program.
Wow, that's great.
And you just approved it last Wednesday, so thank you.
Terrific. Very good. All right, anything further? Okay, without objection, then it'll be the action of the committee to concur with the PWGR Committee's recommendation to approve the draft ordinance as amended by Mr. Blumenfield's recommendation.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to item number 3. Thank you, gentlemen.
Item number 3 already approved.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I
Front
wasn't
item
looking.
number
right.
8.
Item number 9, I think.
Oh.
Oh, wait, we did hold 8. I'm sorry, 8. Yes, thank you.
Just had a quick,
Item 8, sorry about that confusion.
Good afternoon, Gerald Kim with the City Attorney's Office. Just in brief, to explain this motion, the motion would request our office to draft an ordinance to amend certain provisions in the Los Angeles Administrative Code that authorize the issuance and sale of bonds to pay, or other indebtedness to pay obligations imposed by law, which are commonly referred to as judgment obligation bonds. The city attorney would be requested to provide amendments to clarify and expand on the types of settlements that may be paid with judgment obligation bonds in a manner more consistent with current legal practices on how settlements are reached. For example, the current language we have in our admin code can be read to require mediation prior to reaching settlement in order to pay for that settlement with judgment obligation bonds. But reviewing and discussing this with the litigators, mediation doesn't always occur. So that would be one of the things we would eliminate. We would also provide amendments to clarify and expand on the timing for when council needs to make certain findings that are prerequisites to the issuance of these judgment obligation bonds. Those findings that council would need to be made are not being removed. It's just with respect to the timing of when those are made that we provide more flexibility.
Natalie Brill, Sales Office. So when we issued bonds in 9, 10, we redid the procedure ordinance then. So, every time we look at this, we look at state law, what state law allows. State law is pretty clear that we can issue judgment obligation bonds. State law also says that we don't have to, that we can issue 10-year bonds and we can pay 7% over time. But we know we can do better than 7% in the market. So we created this procedural ordinance to allow us to do it. So when Gerald and some of the city attorneys that are newer to the process looked at the current procedural ordinance, they found some things that they thought were unique to us, not necessarily in state law. So they came forward and said, well, if you guys are going to do a judgment obligation bond or are thinking about doing one, we should also amend or recommend to amend the procedural ordinance in the administrative code so that we can make the process a little smoother and easier for you guys if you want to, if the decision is made by the mayor and council move forward. So this is really just procedural, and there's nothing in here that violates state law or is any different, but it just clarifies some of the issues the city attorney felt needed clarification.
Mr. Englander?
Yeah. I've got a couple concerns with this. One,
Sure.
I don't believe we've gotten any, I don't know if it requested a written report back to us, pros and cons looking at this. So I would like to request a report from the CLA. And we have independent contracted advisors, financial advisors as well.
Yes, we do.
So I think it might behoove us to ask for a report from them and the CLA as well, just in this in general, before looking at it further. So this is simply a motion asking the city attorney to come up with some framework. But I didn't ask for any reports back. I think we should have some so we can ask and do additional research on it.
Okay. We did work with bond counsel on this, so anything.
If we can get a report then
Sure.
from our financial advisors, bond counsel, and
That
CLA,
would
I
be
think
fine.
would be very helpful.
Okay.
Although, honestly, I don't want to spend money on reports back about broadening an ordinance that we aren't exercising yet. This only broadens the conditions under which we might choose to issue a
Right.
JOB. So
But we're teeing it up
may or may
already in the
not.
FSR, so that's why I want to make sure that, before we go through that exercise, we've got at least that input.
So I think it might help for you to understand that it's been, like I said, it's been quite a while since we've done one. So what usually happens is the city attorney puts the cases together that it feels that can be done through a judgment obligation bond. And when they come to you, they'll ask for you to make a finding and allow us to consider that case. Once we bundle the cases together, we come back to you and say to you, these are the cases we're thinking of. Now will you allow us to go to court and get validated? Because we do have to go to court and have a validation process. The court has to validate that these really are an obligation imposed by law. That's what judgment obligation bonds are. Once they do that, then there's a period of time that has to pass and the public can object or changes can be made. We'd come back, and then around May, we would come back to you and say, okay, the court has said, yes, we can do these cases. Now will you approve us moving forward the judgment obligation bond? So you'll have at least 2 more chances to look at all the cases that the city attorney will bring forward to you and say, these are the ones that we think apply to be able to do this. Obviously, not all of them, not all of them will, but there's one already that you've approved, which was the independent living for us to do if you decide to get reimbursed. The $21.5 million has already been approved. So all this really does is just clarify that all the cases that are currently in the pipeline, I guess, so to speak, that the procedural ordinance covers them. So, and that's what we did. So the city attorney showed us a list of cases, and bond counsel looked at our procedural ordinance, looked at state law, because that's their role, and said, yeah, this kind of allows you to do a little bit more. Because in the past, we only really did judgments. We never did settlements. Although state law allowed us to, we started to do settlements because state law said, sure, you can do them. So that's why we revamped the ordinance, I believe in 10, right? We redid the ordinance in 9 or 10, I can't remember which one, to allow us to do settlements. And now we're saying, okay, there's different types of settlements, let's expand that definition of settlements. So that's what we discussed with bond counsel and the financial advisors, but we'll be more than happy. I mean, we have the emails. We can put a one-pager together for you to show what they have said to us. It's not a problem.
So what I would suggest is there's kind of 2 parts of this. One is the potential impact that might be had by expanding the scope of the ordinance. And then the other is how it actually applies to a particular given case. What the financial consequences, pluses, minuses might be on a particular case. So what I would suggest is, rather than slowing down the preparation of the ordinance, I would suggest that we ask for both of those reports on both of those scenarios. So if the CLA could report back to us on pluses and minuses of expanding the scope, because I think this explanation makes sense. But you're right, there might be things that we're not anticipating that we should consider. So why don't we go ahead and get that report back simultaneous to the preparation of the ordinance. And then if this isn't exactly on item number 8, it's more relating to some of the things that were discussed on the FSR, which will be coming back to us. But whenever there is going to be a particular expenditure utilizing the judgment obligation bond, then as to those expenditures, I would expect to have a financial analysis of some kind as to whether or not this makes financial sense to do with pluses and minuses.
And that's what the
Does that
finding,
make
not
sense?
to interrupt you, but that's what the finding does. When the city attorney moves forward and says, okay, I want to recommend that this be part of the judgment obligation bond, there is a finding in there. Our problem with providing you with an exact debt service number is that it's December right now. And the judgment obligation bond, if you decide that you want to move forward, wouldn't be done till May. So anything we give you in numbers, like how much will it cost us, is going to be truly an estimate. And we would add 50, 60, 70 basis points to that because we don't know what the market, especially with the new administration, will look like, right?
Right, but we never expect
Right. So
the highest
can
degree
do
of
that, and we
precision,
can
but
provide
but
it's a basis for.
And still getting the CLA report back and bond counsel and financial advisors reports back on, moving forward at all. Certainly the numbers are going to change, so I realize that. And I think we do so in such a way because we should proceed every time on these with severe caution. I'm not suggesting we never do them. We've done them before. They should be limited to, and as the chair pointed out, there are certain times where we're going to get hit with astronomical settlements, and it makes time to stretch some of those out over time financially. And rather than taking the hit and creating layoffs that might be temporary or reducing services or taking police or firefighters off the street, there's ways to stretch out this debt service, if you will. So sometimes that does make sense, but I think we have to do it with extreme caution and have those report backs to make those informed decisions.
If I could just add, and this is not something that gets, for every settlement that comes before your judgment, it's not, the analysis, should we use a judgment obligation bond for this case? That doesn't happen because typically it's not a case by case unless the case is really large, $50 to $100 million, that would be maybe an opportunity to do so. But for the smaller cases that we see, under $10 million, that's not small, but relative to what gets issued, it's only being done right now because we know we have a number of cases in the pipe that are coming for settlement discussion to you, and the aggregate number is a number that we think might be reasonable for us to go to the market with, because these are going to get paid. They're going to get paid, and right now the only source will be the reserve fund. So they have to get paid, and the whole process that is being discussed right now is to allow for the reserve fund and the city to be reimbursed by the proceeds of the judgment obligation bonds so that we end the fiscal year hopefully above 5%.
Well, and what are our analysts going to say to that? How are our credit bureaus going to look at that? Those are the questions we should be asking as well.
We are asking those questions.
And it doesn't just turn into a shell game of, so, and if we're going to look at bundling, and if that's what we might,
That's what we're
it's, that's probably a very bad practice to get used to doing on a regular basis.
We would agree.
So that's why I say if we're going to move forward with this, we do it with both eyes wide open and have the reports back to make sure that we're not going to jeopardize, hopefully, our credit rating as well.
The reserve fund is one of the criteria, that is one of the criteria the rating agencies look
I get
at.
it, but it's only, and it's
All
one.
right, so
But-
debt, the amount of debt you have outstanding, obviously is another one.
Right.
So when we look at the judgment obligation fund, you see how much general fund debt we have outstanding as compared to the reserve fund. And I think that was one of the decision points to even look at this, right? We're 4.12% of the general fund.
Right.
Now. We did a huge refunding in May that really paid off, and we dropped significantly. So when you look at where we are in that criteria, because that's what you asked, right, in that criteria, versus the reserve fund criteria, and you weigh the two, you know, the reserve fund is a big, at that point, the reserve fund becomes a bigger deal than,
Right.
than the rate. And you're right, that's.
Which is why I'd like to see the report back with
And I
those
think that's what we'll-
comparisons. And I think, you know, I'm sure you've already had those discussions. I'm sure CLA has had those discussions.
Right.
I'm sure bond council's had those. We're just looking to see the information of what you guys have discussed.
Look at you one page
Be
from
helpful.
each of them.
That'd be very helpful.
So just for the sake of clarity here, to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Item 8 deals with when under what payment circumstances we can issue a judgment obligation bond, what procedural mechanisms through the court, whether it's settlement, mediation, judgment, and so on. This motion doesn't deal with the financial pluses and minuses. That's a decision that makes once we issue the JO. Am I right on this?
Once we come to you, well, yeah.
And that would be done separately. That's not part of this
Correct.
agenda item. So what I would suggest is, again, on the policy, I would like us to move forward in instructing the city attorney to get going on this, because we need to have this ready for some of the things that they're already considering. But we won't execute on this until such time as we get those financial reports back anyway. So
Right.
we
That's what I'm
can get it, yeah.
And knowing that that was coming, and it's going to be directly related to when, and if we pull those triggers on the FSR for those items, that's why I wanted to wait till item 8 to ask for those things.
Right. So unless there's an objection, we can move forward with item 8, provide the instruction to commence the preparation of the ordinance, which will be coming back, and then at such time as we execute, we issue judgment obligation bonds, obviously we'll have to go through this whole process. You'll be providing this input. We'll be making findings. There will be a much more thorough discussion on the costs and benefits at that time.
Well, that's what I'm asking now, and I think you said it best earlier, is I don't want to hold up the time frame, and I understand that. So if we can get that back concurrently with the same time as the city attorney report.
I think that's possible, because we've already been, like you said,
Right.
we didn't do this blindly, and there was
Right,
discussions about
exactly.
this ordinance.
So if we can get the report back from CLA as well as our financial advisors.
We can,
Great. If you
That'd
can,
be great.
if you feel you can do that,
by next Monday, probably, yes.
great.
Sorry, just to clarify, just to make sure we're not missing anything. So the pros and cons and the weighing would be the pros and cons of the amendments to be made, or the financial analysis of issuing judgment obligation bonds?
No, I think the financial analysis has to be done on every independent, every time we're going to go out to market on it.
Right.
I mean, because this is going to change dramatically.
But that's where you're.
But I think the
you're-
pros and cons are the pros and cons of actually doing it and these amendments to sort of, I'll use the word streamline the process, if you will. So I'd like the report back just based on that.
Okay.
Which is what the motion calls for.
We discussed that with bond counsel and with the FAs, so.
I would
think
imagine
that's
you
not-
did.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then when the ordinance comes back, at that same time, present it to us with a report from the CLA on the policy pluses and minuses of this. Right?
And our financial advisors.
And if you have
We'll do a
that
one-pager.
report that you can bring back on, the proposed application of this at that time as well, that would be, we'd have everything in front of us at that time. It sounds like that's feasible. Is that feasible?
I'm pretty sure, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Perfect.
Great. Good.
Excellent.
Anything further? Then without further objection, that will be the action of the committee. That brings us then to item number 9.
Item number 9 is a Seismic Governance Committee transmittal relative to authorization to increase funding for the 6th Street Viaduct Replacement Project to $482,153,771, and authorization for various transactions related to funding.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Lori Hancock with the CAO's office. Sixth Street Viaduct Replacement Project is being implemented through the CMGC process, which is Construction Manager, General Contractor, Project Delivery Method. And that process requires that a guaranteed maximum price be negotiated for each of the packages, the construction packages that are to be performed within that contract. During the GMP development for the final bridge construction, the SSW, the contractor, reviewed their construction sequencing process, and they came up with an additional 8 months construction time required to complete the bridge. And BOE has estimated that that's going to cost an additional $28.2 million. In order to award the contract in January of 2017 and open the bridge in September of 2020, we need to identify that funding shortfall and find funds to cover that. Caltrans has come up with $15.2 million, and they have confirmed an increased funding commitment for that amount, which leaves the city responsible for approximately $13 million. On November 22nd of this year, SGC heard the BOE report that's attached to our report and is recommending a solution for that funding. $4 million of that is coming from a FEMA reimbursement, which is to the seismic bond as a result of work that was done in the 1994 earthquake. In addition to that, there's $1.3 million in unexpended Prop C that was for the completed First Street Bridge widening project, and which leaves an additional $7.7 million. And it's recommended that BOE seek funding and future budget allocations for staffing and consultant costs in fiscal year 2018-19 and 19-20. In addition to that, they also recommend that there's a budget increase from $446.5 million to $482.1 million for the construction of the bridge, and to increase the contract with SSW, which is Skanska, Stacy, and Whitback, from $273 to $300 million. The contract also should be extended for 2 years through December 31st, 2021. So BOE is here to answer any questions, or I can answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, I got to be honest, I'm still not at all clear why we had this shortfall of $28 million. And maybe, Mr. Moore, if you want to join us too. This was one of those situations where I thought that we had a team approach from the beginning, including the contractor and the designers and everyone. The point of having them participate together, I don't know if it was, exactly design build, but it was, intended to be done as a team effort. I'm not sure why we're having to absorb the costs now of mistakes in sequencing that have led to a significant cost increase. How did this happen?
Good afternoon, Gary Lee Moore, City Engineer. I'm joined by our Project Manager, Julie Allen, and also Alex Medine of the contractor, Skanska, Stacy, and Whitback. This project here, the contract, CMGC, the Construction Manager, General Contractor, to date we've issued about 7 packages to them of approximately $70 million. The most notable being the demolition of the bridge that started in January and is just about done, just a few weeks away from completing demolition. They have been working with us throughout this entire process, and it has been a beneficial process because it is such an iconic bridge, and we've looked at, we've had numerous cost-cutting measures together throughout the process. In February, we set up a cost model and a schedule to complete this bridge, and the contractor had agreed and we had agreed to certain measures of reduction of costs. We met those reductions of costs, and we're not in complete control of what's allowed for the contractor to hire and do, because this is a federally funded project. It is, I would like to note that with this cost increase, 89% of the bridge, over $428 million, will be funded not from the city, will be from the state. So 89% is coming from the state and federal government. So the contractor in this iconic bridge here looked at the what we call the geometric control, how the bridge is being erected, and they actually brought in a specialty engineer to look at this. And they did this from their cost. And when they looked at this, unfortunately, they found a substantial difference in what they had planned to build right as we were in the negotiations, or they were about to submit their price for the actual bridge. So when that came in, it was approximately a year longer than we had anticipated. We did work together to shorten this, and it is unfortunate that we didn't find wasn't found earlier. So, but also Alex can maybe add to that a little bit.
And maybe you could explain. Sorry, but so a layperson can understand. Maybe you can explain what it was that was found. That what was the change that was necessary.
Yeah. So not only is it a very iconic bridge, it turns out to be a very technically complex structure that's extremely sensitive to the sequencing of events in building it. And this engineering firm that we hired, COE Engineering, is a well-renowned company in the nation for these complex structures. They were brought on around the same time frame as our original cost model agreement, and it took them the course of the summertime, starting in the spring and into the summer, to create their model and their computers that would tell them what our sequence of events, how it was going to affect the bridge structure. And it was that sequence, kind of a revelation of what our sequence was doing within the structure, and that coupled with the requirements that had come out from HNTB with regard to submittals and submittal review processes, where the revelation came to the forefront that we weren't going to be able to really start building some of the technical aspects of the structure until some of these the sequence and the submittal process was approved, and that was going to push us just to start some of the stuff above the foundations into summer of 2017. And that beginning of construction, pushing that beginning of construction, is what caused the overall delay.
Just add, we've spent a lot of time with Caltrans, as you heard from Lori's report, that they're contributing over half this cost increase of $15.2 million. So they also, and I think we were all, honestly, Councilman, disappointed, because what we had anticipated all along the process is that we wouldn't be in this situation. And so it was a disappointment for all of us to be in this situation. Caltrans we've spent hours with them, because they had similar and very questions to the process, since we're the first local agency to use the process. And they've, along the way, I think there's going to be changes in the process to help us, the owner, and the contractor in this process. And Julie, anything you want to add? You sure? No, I'm just saying Julie has done I want to compliment Julie. She's done an outstanding job. And as the contractor has, we spent, personally, myself, Julie, and our Deputy City Manager, Alfred Mata, have spent hours and hours negotiating the price, because it was even higher and the time was longer, and we looked to mitigate this, and it's not where we wanted it to be.
Okay. Mr. Bloomfield.
So on those lines, and I was listening carefully, but maybe as a layperson, I couldn't understand the reason. I mean, and looking through the report, it talks about sufficient temperature control of concrete structural elements, and I mean, it just sounds like there were things that you didn't predict that came true. And so what I wonder about that, and maybe your answer was in there, so there's things that came up that caused it to be delayed. Now Caltrans is paying more, we're paying more, and what about the contractor who failed to predict these things? Do they have any liability here? Or would you take any responsibility?
Yeah, we've taken on quite a bit of the burden during the negotiation. We realized, and certainly we're not happy about the late notification of this delay. And so we shouldered a burden of about $15 million during the negotiation in order to stand up for our portion of this.
So in essence, what you're saying is that the mistake is going to cost contractor $15 million,
City
$15 million, and
right.
Caltrans $15 million.
Right. About a third, a third, a third.
Okay. And then is the Caltrans $15.2 million actually going to happen? Is it in writing? Is it?
Yes, we received a letter from Caltrans.
Okay.
Yes, and it was, they had, I know, had multiple conversations with the director of Caltrans. He's very aware of this request, and also I know our local assembly member has also assisted along with Councilman Weezer's office, been very vital in communicating with Caltrans. The commitment was very much vetted inside Caltrans.
And I'm worried about the 1.3 from Prop C that you mentioned. I guess that's okay. The 7.7 million that's going to come out of the 18-19 requests, and I know in the report they talked about maybe Measure M might be used, and that sort of sends up my warning signs because, when local return, that I assume that is assuming the local return money from Measure M, and when the campaign went on, the materials identified how local return would actually be spread out through the San Fernando Valley and other places. The last time Measure M happened, or not Measure M, Measure R, it didn't happen quite so nicely, and the Valley didn't get near its amount of a local return. And as I see things like this happening, I'm worrying that local return is going to be, again, sucked into downtown projects and not actually spread out. So how do you ease my comfort on that or make me more comfortable with it?
One, on the 7.7 million, we anticipate it being over 2 fiscal years. And part of it is for contingency, so we'll see how the project goes. So we'll be looking at any way to mitigate those future years of how to, we understand one other partner who's not here today is the mayor's office, who's also been very concerned, and spent lots of hours with them also because it's a big request, we understand, because it could potentially, if those funding sources are not available. And then Maria wants to add something.
Maybe I can help. Maria Cardenas with the CAO's office. As always, we'll be looking at any type of special funds to mitigate the 1819 and 1920 impact. However, in our report, we do note in the fiscal impact statement that at this time, it would be a general fund cost. So we're looking, we know the concerns on Measure M, and we'll be working closely with our fiscal plant partners, with David Hirano. But at this point right now, we're anticipating that it would be a general fund obligation in those 2 years.
So we're talking about a $7 million general fund hit over the course of 2 years.
Correct.
1819 and 1920, yes, sir.
Yeah, which has its own set of problems. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for raising the point, Mr. Blumenfield, because I think I'll say it explicitly, any attempt to use Measure M local return money for something like this would receive a frosty reception from me, and I'm sure from many others on the council. And I don't want to speak for our Transportation Committee chair, who's not with us, but I suspect it would draw close scrutiny. And it may be that there have to be some other transportation priorities in the area that may need to be reassessed in light of this. It sounds to me from this presentation that we're now far enough along in this process that we don't have a lot of options but to move forward with this. I just want to make sure that what we're talking about right now is having the city be the backstop on that 13 million, of which you expect some $4 million of that to be available through FEMA, 1.3 available through unspent funds, and then The balance, we don't know from where. But that 7.7 million happens to also coincide with what the increased contingency is on the project. So if things go very well, maybe that number will come down to zero. So it raises a lot of concerns, obviously. Mr. Engel, do you have any questions on this? I do want to say that I'm sorry, but I have to say for the record that whatever we do by way of increasing the budget and making future commitments here has to be considered without prejudice to other options we may assess with regard to our legal rights. And I need to say that out loud, because I don't want this to be the final solution if, frankly, some of this was preventable by our contractor. And I don't know that it was or wasn't. I'm just saying, that I think we have to preserve those rights for reimbursement for whatever additional expenses we have. Mr. Blumenfield.
And the sort of the follow-on to all this is, how do we know this isn't just the first one, and that we're going to be back here in 6 months or a year with another problem I can't understand about sequencing that's going to cost us another $40 million or something?
This is the final package for the viaduct construction, and we've done 7 other packages together, and we've seen the change orders in between 1% to 2% in those packages, and that was $70 million worth of work. And so we're in the foundation package of construction right now. So so far it's gone well. And once again, I'll let the contractor speak about the confidence of, where they're at and the status of where the project's at.
Yeah, we're extremely confident that we're going to make the September 22nd date of 2020. We're committed to doing it, and we believe with all the collaboration that we've had with the city and the engineer of record that the low contingency being held by the city should hold, and I believe that change orders will be kept to a minimum. So we're very confident about that.
Okay, and just to clarify again, Mr. Moore, you said that you've already received a written commitment from Caltrans as to their portion?
Yes.
Because I was going to ask for that before we send it to council.
Oh, no.
If you have that.
We have that dated November 18th from Caltrans.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Anything further on this, members? Any objection to advancing this to council?
No objection.
What's that?
Consternation, but no objection.
Yeah, okay. All right, without objection, then it will be the action of the committee to approve the recommendation and forward this to full council.
Thank you.
And is there anything else before us?
No, sir, that clears the desk.
Seeing nothing further, we are adjourned.